Thank you. I'm Doug Richardson, and I'm the executive director of the association, or the American Association of Geographers. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this meeting in Boston. It's been a turbulent time in all of our lives, I think, during the past few months. And I'm happy to report that despite all of that turbulence, we have record attendance at this meeting. Again, we have already registered approximately 9,300 people. So it's a really large meeting, and it's our largest meeting ever this year. So thanks for helping to make that happen. I'd like to take a few minutes and talk, as I usually don't, about policy. And the AG Council and its leadership and myself and the AG staff have been working really hard since the election to try to make sense, first of all, of what was going on, what was likely to occur, and then to begin to resist. And the association has worked very hard to develop not only statements. Statements are important. We make strong statements. We make careful statements. But the most important thing we feel that we can do is to try to make real change, to try to make, to develop strategies that will allow us to to block some of the very damaging kinds of policies that we've seen in the recent budget, for example. Of course, with the travel bans that have been instituted, which have created a great deal of grief for many of our members around the world and here as well. I would advise you to take a look at the work we've been doing on the AG's Policy Action website. It's part of our website that lists out a dozen or so major activities and actions that we have ongoing. I want to just mention a couple of them, and those, of course, are the statements and the legislative work that we've been doing to try to defeat the travel bans. And I think that there's a good chance that most of that will go by the wayside, hopefully. We also are working very closely on the budget that just came out with 30% cuts for EPA, 30% cuts for diplomacy at Department of State. And you can go down the line. We've written a very careful and pointed letter to the administration regarding our opposition to those cuts. And we've offered to actually help them using our geographic expertise to analyze what those cuts would mean in the congressional districts of many of these congressmen who will be voting on this. We think that may turn a head or two. Secondly, we're working very hard on a kind of errant piece of legislation that's come out, which would restrict the use of geospatial data for for racial disparities analysis. This is a crazy kind of bill, but the AG has been way out in front on it, and we were the first to write letters to the sponsors of those bills, both in the Senate and in the House. We then developed a sign-on letter, which we have over 30 people who've signed, organizations that have signed on to that, including the NAACP. It's a terrible piece of legislation. We will defeat that, I'm sure. We've already caused enough stir that people are starting to backpedal on it, and we're going to keep pushing until they fall over backwards. And so I think that's something that we'll make real progress on. We're also working, to join with others, because we are, although a small organization, we're one of the few academic associations that has a full-time policy office and has expertise of at least 3 of our staff in working on the Hill. So we have an option to monitor and keep our membership informed of these, but we can only do so much. And I want to ask right now of each of you to do something that people find annoying to do, or people may say is meaningless to do, and that is to contact your congresspeople in your own home districts. your senators and your representatives about these issues. It does make a difference. And the only way that I can see in our strategy is that we have to find a way to bring 3 of those senators across the aisle to vote against some of these provisions, or we have to bring 22 House of Representatives across the aisle to oppose those. That's what we're working on. That's why we need to keep, in our statements and in our actions, we need to keep doors open for dialogue so that we can continue to push in those directions. And we push in those directions with many other organizations. Lots of associations that we've long been part of and that we have ourselves played leadership roles in. So we are in a good position to work with, for example, COSA, American Council for Learned Societies, CESA, which is the Scientific Association of Associations, the Coalition for National Science Funding. These are all strong groups that we work with in which we play a strong central role in. So we're forming those partnerships. We work very closely with AAAS in many areas, from human rights to opposition of these cuts to science that are out there. We've also partnered with the March for Science, which will occur on April 22nd in Washington, D.C., and in many other cities across the nation and around the world. We welcome you to come to Washington or to march in your own areas. To help move that process along, we've created several large banners that you can see near the registration desk, and we're asking, even if you can't come to one of those marches but you want to be present, you can sign your name on those banners. We've got 10 of those banners that we've designed and created. So add your name to those banners, and either you or we will be carrying your name to the march on March for Science shortly. We also have hats, very nice hats. So Geographers March for Science. These we're selling at cost, $7, which is not much for a quality hat like this. So let's join together. You know, some things about these marches, we played a key role in the Women's March in Washington. We think that these kinds of events are positive events that bring people together, that empower people and give people a sense of community that they can indeed fight back. So this is what we'll be doing in the future, as we have been ever since these problems started cropping up. And you know, to be frank, this is only the beginning of what we're going to see. We're going to see a lot of attacks on funding for universities, for education more broadly, for environmental programs. Many of the things that most of us value greatly are under attack. So we can't take this lightly, and we can't have the privilege and the liberty of not contacting our congressman, because that you may not think it makes a difference, but over time it does. And it's the only way that we're going to stop things during the next 4 years, as far as I can tell. So please join with us. We'll keep you informed. We monitor this daily, if not hourly, and we have lots of postings about what's happening on our website. So that's a little bit longer than I wanted to spend on that issue, but it's so critical to the future of geography, to the future of higher education, and I think to the future of our country, that we take this thing seriously. Now I want to talk about what a wonderful meeting we have set up here, and you're going to see a big chunk of it right now in a few minutes. Let me just mention that we have 3 featured themes, as we typically have during our meetings, and they rotate around different topics. We try to be very inclusive and provide themes that appeal to the full range of our discipline. One of them is, quite appropriately, this was developed long ago, a theme called Mainstreaming Human Rights in Geography in the AG. This is an area that I've been pushing on now for about 15 years, and we work closely with AAAS on the Special Coalition for Science and Human Rights, which we helped to found, in which I served as the chair of their steering committee for the first 5 years of the organization. This is a very important thing. Most people think of human rights as something that is international, deals with third world countries or something. It also is relevant here in the United States. It's also relevant in how we conduct our work as scholars, as researchers, as geographers. So there's a lot to learn on this. We have a tremendous, I think, unprecedented set of sessions around this idea. And we have 50 sessions, 250 speakers on this topic, and many of them are leaders, international leaders in major civil human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and many others. So I urge you to, we're going to kick that off with a conversation tomorrow with Noam Chomsky, which will be my third interview with him over the years, and we enjoy doing these interviews and bringing them to geography. So we hope we will see many of you tomorrow. I think it's 5:20 that the session starts. That's the kickoff, but there's a rich, rich vein of other sessions that follow on that one. A second major theme is one that focuses on one of the growing areas of our discipline that is now a part of all of what we do, from human geography to physical geography and so forth, and that's the GI science and the new technologies. And one of the key theoretical areas that's most important on the cutting edge of these fields are the questions of uncertainty and context in GI science. So we have a very distinguished scientific committee, which will be having a plenary tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. And the scientific group that's pulled this theme together represents the constellation of probably our leading GI scientists, Mike Goodchild, May-Po Kwan, Dan Griffith, and Tim Schweinen of Oxford University will be leading a very rich and, I think, cutting-edge discussion of these key issues that impact not only GI science, but also much of geography in many key ways. So I hope you'll take that in. That opening plenary is tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Very quickly, we're also responding to the external events that we have here with special policy events, some of them specifically on the U.S. elections. And so look for those sessions. They'll be on the geograms that come out. We've got several sessions that really are trying to tackle that issue. One of the sessions involves many of our past presidents, and Glen MacDonald has pulled that together. I think it'll be very interesting. That's on Saturday at 5:20 p.m. We also are focusing on the need for greater public outreach. I think we do a reasonably good job of communicating to our members, but in this day and age, I think we need to also develop stronger communication to the broader public. Derek Alderman has put together a nice session that addresses these issues, the need for public intellectuals in a Trump America. And then a second one, which I think will dovetail nicely with that session, is we have Rush Holt, who's the Chief Executive Director of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. It's great to have him here. He's in great demand. Not only is he the new Executive Director at AAAS, but he's also a former congressman, and also he's a former I'll get that. Oh yeah, he's a former Jeopardy star, so he's quite an interesting guy. And I've gotten to know him well and was able to convince him to come to our meeting. So he'll be speaking at noon tomorrow. We have a lot of big name lectures. Sarah Bednarz, our past president, will be giving her presidential election or presidential lecture. James Hansen, who many of you know from his climate change work, will be our honorary geographer. He'll be speaking. And David Harvey, whom all of you know, will be giving us a very special lecture as well. So we've got a lot of high-profile activities going on. Finally, we'll also be launching the International Encyclopedia of Geography, a 15-volume new reference resource for geography. And that has involved 1,000 authors plus, about 30 or so editors, and it's been a great privilege to be part of that. And part of this process is not only the outcome, which I think is fantastic, but it's also been a process by which we've helped to develop an international community of geographers, and the kind of collaboration that we've done with authors and editors from around the world has really been gratifying. So with all of that, I would like to then mention one further thing, and that is I would like to have Oscar Larson stand up. Oscar, where are you? Back there. And the rest of the AG staff, would you please stand up? And would the members of our local organizing committee for this meeting stand up? I think very few people understand the enormous amount of work that goes into putting on a large conference like this. It's basically a year-round activity, but it requires a calm head and a steady hand, and Oscar Larson has done that well for us for many years. So let's give them all a hand of appreciation. So now I want to introduce briefly what you're going to see tonight, which is the third theme. It's called Geographies of Bread and Water in the 21st Century. And this is something that Glen has pulled together. He's got a distinguished group of speakers and commentators. So why don't you come up here, and Glen, you can introduce the members of your forum. Thanks.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming to the plenary opening session. And I hope you enjoy it. I know I'm certainly going to really learn a lot and enjoy this. I have the honor and the great pleasure and the responsibility of being the president of the American Association of Geographers. And those of you who voted for me, I thank you for your confidence. For those of you who didn't, I want names. And so one of the great pleasures of doing this, though, is that you get to put together a panel and have a plenary session to talk about something that's near and dear to you. Now, if those of you, the few of you out there who might know my work, know that I actually do research on long-term climate change and its impacts, and I started out working in the area of fossil pollen and spores. Absolutely fascinating. And yet here I am with a session, my presidential plenary session, really about providing food and water for the world's populations in the 21st century. How did I go from fossil pollen and spores to this? Well, that's the beauty of geography, right? If you're a geographer, you think far outside of any silo. You learn to connect dots. You learn to think spatially and over deep time periods. And the writ of being a geographer gives you the permission and the ability to think big. And I think we, as geographers, should think big. I think we are facing a 21st century where the provision of food and provision of water are going to be a major defining aspect of how well we succeed or how we fail over the 21st century. And I wanted to share that with you, and I also wanted to share with you some of the really great minds within our discipline and then beyond our discipline who are working on these questions and have really envisioned this long before I started thinking deeply about it, and whose work I have learned from. And so that is why I chose this theme for my plenary session. I did not want to think merely about my own research. I wanted us to think big as geographers and tackle the big questions that we are facing. And so I'm going to share with you then the journey in terms of where I think we are on this and what's informed me and helped me, motivate me to put this together. Then we will have our speakers come up. I'll try to be brief. And that following their presentations, I'll introduce each one in turn. Following their presentations, we'll have a period of time for questions from the audience. But we will try not to break up the presentations with questions. Okay. This is, of course, our panel, and I will introduce them as each one comes up to speak. This was, for those, anyone read the newsletter online or read the, yeah, a few of you do. I'm glad to see that. And probably there'll be 3 of you who read the presidential columns. Let me tell you, it's blood, sweat, and tears towards the end of each month getting that out there. So please go back and read these things. But my second presidential column was on this topic, and the title then is what gave the title to this session. And some of my thinking was outlined in that set of writings on this topic. So let me just take you through that then. If we take a look, and there's lots of different estimates from different groups, but I'm going to use just UN data. And if we look at that, maybe approximately 800 million people suffer from hunger today, of one sort or the other. It doesn't mean that they're facing starvation, but they at least go to bed hungry at night. And that's a lot of people. Now, if you look at the hot colors on that map, those are the areas where you could have up to 35% or more of the population are facing hunger, malnourishment, poor nutrition of one sort or the other. And then you get to the dark colors, the gray, the area where we don't have data, but some of those places exceed that number. And what you notice is that there is a sort of a bullseye on Africa, that Africa really, really has a huge issue in terms of the provision of food and hunger. But this extends beyond Africa to parts of the Americas and to parts of Asia. The map itself is hopeful and says that progress has been made, and indeed progress has been made. There were dire predictions about where we would be in terms of hunger looking into the 1960s and 70s. And in many parts of the world, there has actually been an increased improvement in nutrition and in the stability of provision of nutrition. But we still are facing, as you'll see, we still are facing real problems. On the same hand, if we take a look at water, the provision of water, which underlies in many parts of the world the successful provision of food and the avoidance of hunger and famine, there's about 1.2 billion people, according to UN figures, that live in areas of physical water scarcity. As the water's just not that available there, and 500 million more are approaching that situation due to depletion of groundwater, for example, changes in climate, and of course, increasing population and demand for water resources. And another 1.6 billion people face economic water shortage. In other words, clean drinking water, water for irrigation is too expensive. It's problematic. And so you can also notice, though, that part of the areas where we have a lot of issues are, again, Africa seems to be central to that, and particularly a lot with economic water shortage, but this extends to the other continents as well. Now, if we then take a look forward into the 21st century and we look towards 2050 or so, world population will probably increase to somewhere between 9 and 9.7 billion people. And if we look at that increase, we'll see that it is really the light green color there, the developing world, the global south, where the growth of that population will occur. Not so much at all in the global north or the developed world, but in the global south. And if we then look at a map, a cartoon map of where that population growth is expected to occur, we'll see that it overlaps with the areas where we're facing both water and food crisis today, particularly looking at sub-Saharan Africa, but extending beyond that, again, to the Americas and into Asia. So we have not solved the hunger problem. The water provision problem is increasing, and with these figures, we would expect then that this will become more acute as we move towards the 21st century, putting more people and more demand exactly in those regions where we're having problem meeting demand today. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, then, to meet those demands in terms of food, you require some 3 billion tons of additional cereal, maybe 200 million tons of meat production. And then by 2025, they estimate some 1.8 billion people will be living in areas with significant water scarcity. So this is not going to simply get better in and of itself. It will become more acute pressure, both for food and for water. Now, as I said, we've done a pretty good job in terms of with the Green Revolution, in terms of keeping up with food demand, and in many areas actually having better nutrition today than we would have seen in the 50s, 60s, and the early 70s. But this was an interesting study which came out in PLOS 1 in 2013, and it looked at just the trend line, how technology, how better irrigation, better agricultural practices has kept pace with population, and then it's projecting then those trends with population growth and the trends of improvement in terms of agricultural productivity into the 21st century to 2050. And you will see then for maize, rice, wheat, and soybean, there is a divergence where the projected population increase in terms of the dashed line will outstrip the trends that we've seen over the 20th century in terms of keeping up with food demand. That's the empirical data. If we were to continue at the same rate of technological and other advances, the population increase, and particularly in those developing or global south regions, will outstrip then the rate in which we increase food productivity, according to this analysis. On top of that, we have the challenges of global climate change. Global climate change in some areas will increase agricultural productivity. But this was an analysis which recently came out in 2014. It's a meta-analysis of papers which have looked at predictive modeling of how climate change will affect crops. And there's basically here about 1,090 scenarios, different crop types, different kind of things, which were produced by 42 different studies. And this is then looking at a meta-analysis of those results. And if we look then at the period 2050 or so, what you will see, the red and yellow are areas where crop production drops by 50 to over 50, for 25 to over 50% compared to today. And you will see that the majority then of the studies suggest that we will see a net decrease in productivity as we approach 2050, and that will become absolutely acute as we approach the end of the century, based on the meta-analysis of modeled climate change and modeled crop response from a number of different studies. There are some studies that show that there will be improvement, but they are in the minority. By the time we get to 2090, only about 25% of the studies suggest there'd be any improvement in any of the crops. So things looking forward in terms of climate change, despite CO2 fertilization, despite the fact that some areas will become actually better for certain crops, suggests that we could be facing a net deficit by the middle of the century and a large one by the end of the century. So, Stephen O'Brien, Undersecretary General for the Humanitarian Affairs in the UN, said, "We are facing the largest humanitarian crisis since the creation of the United Nations." Folks, he wasn't talking about 2050. He was talking about right now, 2017. So if we think we can be complacent about this, we simply cannot. He's talking about what's going on in four countries in Africa, principally Yemen, South Sudan, Somalia, and northeastern Nigeria, where according to UN estimates, 20 million people are at risk for starvation. They are at risk for starvation for a triad of reasons. One is, of course, agricultural productivity, economics, technology, but also warfare and drought. A perfect storm there, which is essentially, in terms of UN record keeping, the worst potential crisis since the UN was founded in 1945. So let's not be complacent. Now, the Secretary General of the United Nations said to tackle this, 20 million people, to tackle this would require about $4.4 billion by the end of March. Well, they raised about $423 million. So a fraction of what the UN considers it's required to avert a real massive humanitarian catastrophe in parts of Africa. So then we're going to step back and we take a look at the political situation here in the United States. And we take a look at the proposed cuts to State Department and U.S. aid, foreign aid. And I think it's encapsulated by what Mick Mulvaney, who is the U.S. Presidential Budget Director, said. Quote, "Spend less money on people overseas and more money on people back home." State Department, which is, of course, responsible for most of the foreign aid that's produced by the United States government, is looking at an $11 billion or 28.7% cut. Agriculture Department is looking at about a 20% cut. Just for comparison, The Department of Defense is looking at about a 10% increase, or $54 billion increase. They're getting an increase of well over 10 times the amount that it would require to try to avert the catastrophe in Africa, as estimated by the UN. Now, it's easy then to say, okay, let's get the U.S. government to throw more money at this problem. That's going to solve this problem, okay? I think that we are kidding ourselves if we think, I think we should have more money, we should avert a disaster there, but I think that that is not going to be the solution either. First off, we could do a little bit of rejigging in terms of how we provide that aid. According to current law, we have to transport 50% of the aid on U.S. flagged vessels, and the food aid must be purchased in the United States. Based on the way in which we produce food aid today in this country, we basically have a waste or a loss of about $471 million per year in terms of what might be considered inefficiency. If we were to do more local sourcing of the food, if we were to use cheaper transportation, we might save about $471 million. Which is, folks, that's about how much has been spent right at present, or is available to deal with the famine and the crisis in Africa. And so there are efficiencies we might see in the money that we spend on this. But it still is $471 million with a $4 billion issue in Africa alone. Okay, it's not going to get us there. The United States is the largest contributor for food aid around the world. And if we take a look at that, in 2016, we gave more than $2 billion to the UN Food Program. That's about a quarter of the World Food Organization budget. In terms of those 4 African countries, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Yemen, of the money that's available, the U.S. has contributed about $277 million thus far. We have, of course, had, in terms of per capita gross domestic product, a very high GDP. In terms of global gross domestic product, it's been very high. But there are other countries coming up. And I think it's fair to say that this has to be a global response. I don't believe that the U.S. should be cutting back on food aid, but I also don't believe that we would expect that other nations, particularly as their GDP increases, should not be stepping up and producing a higher amount of that food aid. So we might look to other countries to join in partnership with the United States to help to increase food aid. That might all be good. But there are a lot of questions of whether the model of every time we have a famine, or we project long-term food scarcity, or water scarcity for that matter, is best dealt with by having developed world or the global north putting money into the developing world or the global south. This has been the model since the 1950s and 1960s, and we still are facing crises in parts of the world. So people have questioned from all sides of the political spectrum, is this the right model going forward? Or do we have to fundamentally change the way we think about food resources, we think about water resources, how we involve local economies, local cultures, how we look at food choices? In other words, I don't think that throwing money at this is just the simple solution. I think that we need to step back and take a look at what we're doing and think about thinking outside the box and thinking a little bit forward-looking. Now, I want you just to think about this. I said that there's 20 million people, according to those UN estimates, which are in jeopardy of starvation, of very severe famine in Africa. We're enjoying Boston today. The greater Boston area has almost 5 million people, 4.7 million people. So think about that. When you step out and you look out of your hotel room and you're looking across that city, you're thinking about all the people you encounter here. We're talking about a crisis which is involving basically 4 Bostons, that many people. And that's what we're kind of facing right now. Now, the people that we're going to have speaking here have thought deeply about this. They are thinking outside the box. They're thinking about these resources in different ways, different approaches to the solutions. I'm so motivated and impressed by the thoughtfulness of the folks that we're going to have speaking. I'm looking at the problem. This is not my area to solve, but I think it's something we all together need to work on. And I wanted to share with you just people who I think are just brilliant and are working on that. So I'm going to call up our first speaker then. Our first speaker is going to be Ruth DeFries. She's a university professor, which is highest professor rank at Columbia University. She has her bachelor's in earth sciences from Washington University, a PhD in geography and environmental engineering from Johns Hopkins. She is one of the authors in the Eco-Modernist Manifesto. She's just produced a book about the wrench and leveraging in terms of ways to solve some of these problems, leveraging human ingenuity. She is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and she is a MacArthur Fellow. And she has worked on these issues in South America and globally using a combination of remote sensing, on-the-ground work, and modeling. And so, ladies and gentlemen, Ruth DeFries.
Good evening. Thanks to you all for being here at this hour. Thanks to Doug for all the work that you're doing in these difficult times, and to Glen for that introduction and that challenge to think in out-of-the-box ways about these really serious issues that we face in the 21st century. I wanted to bring in the issue of not just how much food we produce, the world produces, but the quality of that food. So if there's one message I want to have you take away from this, it's not just about calories, not just about quantity, it's about the nutrients and the nutrition and the quality of the food that's produced. That is, I think, even a greater challenge for the coming century. Is it? This one? What do? You just push the green one. Oh, that's easy. Okay, well, the last century witnessed an astounding achievement. There's been such an increase in population, as Glen has alluded to, but even a bigger increase in the amount of cereals produced. So the per capita production of cereals is greater today than it was in 1960. That is an amazing, amazing fact. Something that we should be proud of in our ingenuity to achieve that. With that has come a good decline in the number of people that are undernourished, whether you count that by the World Food Summit in terms of total numbers, not quite meeting the target, but meeting the target in terms of percentages from the Millennium Development Goals. So that is a very positive trend. 800 million people going to bed hungry is certainly nothing that we should be proud of at all in this world of plenty that we live in, but there is a declining trend, and that is going in the right direction as people come out of extreme poverty and are able to afford to partake in the abundance that the world produces. But let's think about this for a minute. This is estimating the number of undernourished in the world. And what's the definition of undernourished? The definition is the proportion of the population whose dietary energy consumption is less than what nutritionists recommend. That's dietary energy consumption, that's calories. That leads us to what I think is even a bigger challenge for this century, and that is undernourishment is increasing. There are lots of calories in the world, but how nutritious is that food, and is that actually leading to better nutrition? So we have a great challenge of this century that the 20th century increase in food production or calorie production has brought us to, and that is the pretty serious increase in the percentage of people who are overweight and obese. And this is not just a developed country issue. If you look at these statistics here from the Lancet, the proportion of people who are overweight and obese is increasing even more rapidly in the developing part of the world, and now the percentage of women who are overweight or obese in the developing world is approaching 30%. That's a really big number and increasing, and children as well. Which leads us to think about going from undernourishment, which is a deficiency of calories, to malnourishment, which the FAO defines as deficiencies, which can be either excesses or deficiencies, and imbalances in the consumption of macro and micronutrients. We've gone to expand the thinking from just calories to nutrients. And there's a dual side to this. On one side, there is the overconsumption and the diabetes and so on that leads to. On the other side, there's the deficiency of micronutrients. So we know the number of undernourished is around 800 million in the world today. The number of people with chronic micronutrient deficiencies is greater than 2 billion. So it's a pretty serious problem throughout the world. Difference in this dual challenge, if we look at the trends in income and in time, the iron deficiency, the micronutrient deficiency, so iron is the most prevalent micronutrient deficiency, I think that's fair to say. The lower income countries have more iron deficiency, but that is decreasing over time. The other side, the overconsumption, the diabetes, the other way, the higher income countries have higher people suffering from diabetes, and that is increasing over time. So there's a very complex mix of different challenges in this malnourishment issue. So I'm going to talk a lot about India. That's because that's where I work, and I have examples from our own work. I'm sure you can all bring in other examples. So we look at these estimates of the percent of the population that is deficient in different micronutrients here, protein, vitamin A, iron, and zinc, according to income groupings, 1 being low and 4 being high income. And these numbers are pretty big. The number of people who are iron deficient, even at high income levels, around 70%. That's a pretty big number. And we see a rather stubbornness in that the slopes of these lines are not very steep, except for vitamin A, which comes from fruits and vegetables that you'd expect to increase with income. But India is a case where the decline in the improvement in nutrition does not seem to follow the trend that you would expect it to with increasing economic growth. So there's a lot of stubborn micronutrient deficiency. So we have to look at why that might be the case. So here's a very common scene that if you've traveled through South Asia and other parts of Asia, rice, very, very common cereal. See it everywhere. Less common are these other traditional cereals, sorghum, different kinds of millet, foxtail millet, pearl millet, and so on. These are the cereals that previously were more common in the diets and are being overtaken by the production of rice. So we see, if we look back since the Green Revolution, and I'm a believer that the Green Revolution did a lot of good things in getting people fed and reducing famine. But one thing that it did was it focused on high-yielding cereals, rice and wheat, and less so on the more nutritious traditional cereals, millet, sorghum, and so on. We see this very clearly in the statistics here, that the proportion changed. Rice, of course, was always a big part of the diets, as they are in throughout Asia, but the proportion of rice in the production increased incredibly during these last couple of decades. What's the issue with that? The issue with that is that the high-yielding cereals are lower in micronutrients than the traditional cereals who decreased in proportion of the production. In terms of energy, the calories, the undernourished undernourishment part of the story, all of these cereals are about the same, but in terms of micronutrients, particularly iron and zinc, the traditional cereals fare much better on a per serving kind of basis. So the upshot of that is that if you take all of the cereals which were produced in the country and shake them all together, and I take out a handful and give you a 100-gram serving, the nutrient content of that mixture of cereals is lower now than it was in 1960. Production has increased dramatically, but the nutrient content per serving has decreased. Stayed the same in terms of energy and pretty much in terms of protein, but in terms of micronutrients of iron and zinc, on a per serving basis, that has declined. That means if you were going to meet all of your requirements for these nutrients from eating cereals, you'd have to eat more. In the case of iron, about 1/3 more cereals to meet that need. So the question is, we have this declining undernourishment. We know that we're pretty good at producing a lot of stuff, a lot of calories. We know we're not so good at the quality of those calories that are produced. So how do we think about meeting this in the 21st century? And I want to go through some ways we might be able to think about this at different kinds of scales. So here's an analysis that we did a couple of years ago, which looked at the diversity in the crop production within a country versus the food supply. So it's been really wonderful for me to work with nutritionists who have detailed knowledge about nutrition, which I certainly don't, and learn a lot from them. One of their basic metrics for nutritious diets is diet diversity. The way in ecology, a basic metric for the health of an ecosystem is biodiversity. So we took some of the metrics that are used in ecology for diversity and applied them to diversity in food production and food supply. So if we assess what the diversity of nutrients is in food production and compare that with the diversity in the food supply, we're basically looking at the difference between trade, what's produced inside the country and what the country actually has within its borders to feed to its citizens. And the supply is the production, and then accounting for the taking out the exports and putting back the imports, some other factors. But basically, it's taking account of trade. And if you stare at these global maps long enough, you'll see that it's really hard to pick out any patterns, that there's different geographies going on here. For example, let's look at Brazil. Not a particularly high diversity in food production, but a high diversity in food supply, importing. Look at a country like Malaysia, where there's a pretty low diversity in the production and a high diversity in the food supply. That means there's a nutritious range of items for citizens to choose from if they can afford it. This doesn't say anything about distribution. So what's going on here is pretty obvious that if a country can afford to import, then imports can compensate for a lack of diversity in the production. Taking two examples, one being Nepal, a low-income country, where the production and the supply diversity are very much coupled, and there has been some increase in that. Contrasted to the case of Malaysia, where Malaysia previously had some increase in the diversity of its production, but then took the route of being specialized, and that specialization was oil palm, which has led to fantastic increase in wealth. Malaysia is now a middle-income country, largely due to oil palm. What that's meant is that the diversity in their food production has declined dramatically, as you can see from that graphic, but the imports have compensated for that in in the food supply. So here we see a decoupling. So the point of this is that globalization and trade can be a good thing, a positive thing for countries who can afford to import diversity into their food supply. But if a country is too poor, then it's very problematic, and if they have low diversity in their production, then they'll have low diversity in their supply. Thinking about within a national scale, so that was at a sort of global, international scale. Within a national scale, how do we think about what it is that countries are deciding to grow? So we know that for the Green Revolution, there's been so much focus on rice, and that's where so much of the research effort went. So I want to share with you an analysis we did in central India, which is a place where we do quite a bit of work, to look at what are the crops that are being grown, and is that the most nutritious decision for that region. So this is an area, like most of the country, where the predominant crop is rice. The yields are low. Those diamonds are the national average. So the yields are 4 times below the national average, and the national average is already far below the global average. There is some of the traditional cereals. There used to be more, the sorghum, small millets, and maize. And we did an analysis where we looked at the nutritional yield, how many nutrients are being produced per hectare. Not how many calories or how many tons, but how many nutrients are being produced per calorie, and how resilient are those crops to climate variability. So how might they fare in a situation of climate change, which India certainly faces, in terms of being resilient to climate variability? And what we see there from these spider diagrams is that in terms of providing nutrients per hectare, the traditional cereals do pretty well, except for small millets, which are highly nutritious, but the yields are so low that you'd need a lot of land area. In terms of climate sensitivity, the traditional cereals do pretty well. Rice does not come out looking so good on this, except for the cost factor. So how do we take these kinds of considerations about nutrition and about climate resilience and all other different kinds of dimensions into decisions about what crops get the research attention, what crops get agricultural extension attention, and what benefit can there be from thinking about different kinds of cereals. At a subnational scale, we might assume, and many people do, that urbanization, which we know is a major dynamic force in the world, and we can expect to see a lot more of it, is a way to achieve diet diversity, and it may be, in some cases, a way to achieve upward mobility, a way for people to have more access to different options in their diets. But when we looked at this question in India, this surprised me a little bit. What we actually found, this is now pulling apart that data that I showed you previously and stratifying it by urban and rural populations. The solid lines are urban and the dashed line is rural, and this is showing the percent of the population that's deficient in those nutrients. And what we see here is that the urban populations across these income groups have higher percent of the population being deficient. So even at high incomes, the only exception to that is the vitamin A, with the which comes from fruits and vegetables. So high income, then you have a switch. But generally, across all of these nutrients, urban populations, regardless of income level, are more nutrient deficient than rural populations. So this seems like something that should get some consideration when we think about urbanization and we think about the benefits and costs of urbanization as urbanization goes forward. I'm not sure how this would look in other countries. Maybe some of you know, but in the Indian case, it certainly does seem to be the case that urbanization, we cannot assume that urbanization is a way to lead to more nutritious diets. Finally, getting down to the local village level, how can we think about meeting this challenge in better diets? In the kind of village level, local level development activities that might be focusing on other problems, but how do we incorporate the nutrition into that kind of thinking? So here's a study we did in southern India in the state of Karnataka, and we looked at a biogas program. Now this biogas program is one of a successful program that is voluntary for households to participate. And they can use the manure from their cows and put it into a biodigester. So this woman here is, every day she collects the manure from the cows, puts it in that biodigester. I don't think you can see it in this picture, but in the upper right corner, there's a pipe that's coming out from the ground. So underground, there's a biodigester, and the gas comes through the pipe and goes into the house, and then there is a range, and she turns on the stove, just like you and I would turn on a gas stove. And what she's not doing is collecting fuel wood, spending hours a day, going into the forest, bringing headloads of fuel wood back, and breathing the indoor air pollution. So the justification for biogas projects like this is mostly for improving indoor air quality, and in this case, there's some carbon credits that come out of it. Nutrition was not really part of the justification or thinking about this intervention, but we did find that the households that participate in the biogas, compared to the households that don't, have a more nutritious diet. They eat from more food groups, and the children eat breakfast, the women have more free time, multiple benefits. The point being that in our development kinds of interventions, how do we fold in nutrition, even though that might not be the primary goal of the development initiative? So that's at the local kind of scale. So just to sum up, how do we think about ways we could meet this challenge, the not by bread alone challenge, that when we think about bread in the next century, it's not just bread, it's a much bigger issue about diet diversity, about reducing micronutrient deficiencies, about quality diets, and multiple ways to think about that at different scales in terms of trade, in terms of cropping decisions within a country, in terms of urban, the whole move towards urbanization and how we think about diets within that setting, local efforts, development interventions, folding in micronutrients. But the main message I want to leave you with is when we think about food systems, and I know that many of you work on food systems, I think the challenge of quality is a bigger challenge than quantity. I think we've shown that we can produce lots and lots of calories. How do we then incorporate the quality of those calories that we're producing into our thinking about this century? So there's lots of wonderful collaborators that I've had the pleasure of working with on these issues that are very interdisciplinary and very much in the heart of geography, but in that interdisciplinary piece of geography, which is what makes geography so wonderful. And I thank you and look forward to discussion later.
So our next speaker is Peter Gleick. He was the founder of the Pacific Institute in Oakland. That is one of the world's leading think tanks on water policy, water management, water resources, both in the Western United States and California, but globally. Peter now is the President Emeritus of the Pacific Institute and Chief Scientist. He has a Bachelor's of Science from Yale and a Master's of Science and a PhD from Berkeley, where he worked on natural resources and environment. Peter is also a MacArthur Fellow, and he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he is going to talk about water challenges.
Well, good evening, everyone. This is actually my last slide. I'm not sure if that's intentional or not, or a subtle signal. There we go. Okay. Thanks to the AAG for inviting me and to Glenn for organizing the session. It's great to hear from Director Richardson about the activities of the AAG. It's a little inspiring, and thanks to Ruth for her insights on the bread part of the bread and water conversation that we're having. I'm going to talk about the water part of this. I'm going to talk about science and history of water and some of the ways I think about our global water challenges and solutions. I'm not going to talk about politics. I do all too often anyway. If you follow my Twitter feed, you'll see some of that. I'm going to be at the March for Science on April 22nd in San Francisco, and at the Climate March a week later, April 29th in DC. If you want to know why, I wrote a piece for Wired magazine a few weeks ago about that, and you can look at that. But let me talk about water. So I'm going to talk about the idea of peak water in the context of our global water challenges and what I think it means, some of the new trends and challenges that we face in addressing our water problems, and I'm going to talk about some solutions. I think there are solutions out there for our water problems, and I think that's the good news, which I'll try and leave you with at the end. The short story here is that water is connected to everything that we care about and everything that you're working on as geographers. Of course, it's connected to agriculture and food. I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. It's connected to forestry and natural ecosystems and human health and industrial production and the conversations that we're having increasingly about infrastructure investments. It's connected to energy in many different ways. And that's one of the reasons why I love the topic. It's connected to all of the things that we care about. So a quick reminder of the importance to us of a modern water system. 100 years ago, when we didn't have modern water systems, we had cholera and dysentery and typhoid and a whole host of water-related diseases. This is a cover of a magazine from 1912 showing cholera killing thousands, tens of thousands or more people, largely in our cities in Europe and in the United States and frankly across the world, because people were drinking water that was contaminated with cholera and dysentery and typhoid and all of the diseases that were prevalent at the time. And then science and technology and engineering put in place the water systems that we now in the developed parts of the world have come to take for granted. This is a graph that shows typhoid deaths in the city of Philadelphia. It could be cholera deaths, it could be New York, it could be any of the major cities of Europe. Starting at the far left in 1880s and going up to about the 1940s, cholera deaths per 100,000 people. And the first blue line is when the city of Philadelphia first introduced filtration, followed a couple of years later in about 1909, 1910, by the first chlorination systems. And that was followed by basically the elimination of cholera and typhoid and dysentery in cities around the developed world. A modern water system got rid of those water-related diseases that unfortunately are still prevalent in many parts of the world. And now we don't see cholera, typhoid, those water-related diseases, where we have a modern tap water system. But it's the 21st century, it's 2017, and global challenges remain around water resources. As Glenn mentioned briefly, and we've seen in other talks today, there are probably 2.25 billion people worldwide today that don't have access to adequate, affordable sanitation. There are probably 700 million people or 800 million people that don't have access to safe, affordable drinking water worldwide. And because of that, We have millions of cases of unnecessary, preventable deaths every year from water-related diseases, mostly children, mostly under the age of 5. This isn't a technology problem. This isn't really, in my opinion, an economic problem. This is just a failure to apply the technology and to spend the economic resources that are available to solve those preventable diseases, to solve those challenges. We have water quality problems as well, old water quality problems in terms of human wastes and industrial wastes, and new water quality problems in terms of new chemical pollutants that are also not addressed even in countries like the United States. We have ecosystems that are deteriorating from human use of water. All of the water that humans use come out of the natural ecosystems that also depend upon those water resources. And many of our ecological problems worldwide can be traced to the way humans have developed water systems or the way humans use water resources today. We have political conflicts over water, and I'm not going to talk much about politics, but one of the things we do at the Pacific Institute is we track the connections between water and politics and water and conflicts and water and security in the broad sense of the term, environmental security. And those conflicts are growing, not decreasing. And the climate is changing. We know the climate's changing. We know that humans are responsible. We know that the consequences of climate change are already evident and are growing and will be severe, despite what you might hear on the political side about the conversation about climate. That's a reality, and it's a reality that's going to get worse. And it's a water problem. The hydrologic cycle is the climate cycle, and the connections between climate change and water resources are very close. And I'm not going to talk much more about that. I'm a climatologist and a hydrologist by training. I like to think of myself as a geographer. But all of these issues are science issues, they're economic issues, they're political issues, and they are the nature of the water challenges that we face worldwide. And so let me talk about this in a different way. I wrote a paper with a colleague a couple of years ago on peak water. I'm going to describe what I mean by peak water in the context of some of these water challenges. And I'm going to do it using the curves that all of us as geographers or scientists are familiar with. But before I do that, let me describe first one definitional thing, and that is the difference between a renewable and a non-renewable resource, because it's relevant for a lot of the conversations that we're having here. So one way to think about this is that non-renewable resources are stock limited. They're limited by the amount that's out there. Oil, natural gas, coal. Fossil fuels are non-renewable resources on a time scale of any interest to humans. There are stocks of them out there, and the amount that we can use is dependent on the stock that's available. Renewable resources are flow limited. They're not stocks, they're flows. Solar energy, classic renewable resource. The amount of solar energy that we can use is limited only by the flow of solar energy that hits the Earth, that we're able to mobilize. That's what limits our access to renewable resources, wind energy, some water resources. So water, interestingly enough, has characteristics of both stocks and flows. We think about water as a renewable resource, the hydrologic cycle. But there are some aspects of water that are also stocks. And I'm going to come back and talk about water in this renewable, non-renewable context as well. So the first curve I want to talk about is this one. It's the classic exponential curve that all of us see all the time in some of the aspects of the things that we do. Global population. This is a graph of global population from the year 1000 to the year 2000, 1,000 years of global population, and it shows that classic exponential growth. And Glenn showed a population slide, and you're all familiar with that. Global CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere from the year 1000 to the year 2000, showing an exponential growth in CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. And this is the climate problem that we're familiar with, or methane, or any number of greenhouse gases. So the second curve is exponential growth followed by a peak and then a decline in something, and all of us are familiar with this kind of a curve as well. We see it, for example, with the concept of peak oil and US oil production. This is oil production in the United States from 1900 to the year 2000. It's actually gone up again with the fracking boom, but this is a classic curve that we see with non-renewable resources. We start to extract them, there's a peak of extraction, and then for economic reasons, for political reasons, for environmental reasons, we see a decline. But we see this with some, in theory, renewable resources as well. This is the cod capture in the Atlantic. Cod, fish species, in theory, a renewable resource, but we've managed to turn cod pretty much into a non-renewable resource. And it shows the exponential growth in the capture of cod as the fleets got better and better, our ability to find them got better and better. And then for ecological reasons and population dynamic reasons, a crash in the cod population in the North Atlantic that to this day has still not recovered. The third curve is a sort of a combination of these. It's exponential growth in something, it's the classic logistics curve, and then a leveling off and a constant something after a period of time. And we see this with the penetration of technology into society, for example. This is a curve of the penetration of landline telephones in the United States from 1900 to the year 2000. Actually, interestingly enough, this is probably going down now. But we see this with the penetration of cell phones, and we see the penetration of almost any technology that any of us adopt. Something brilliant is invented, we start to buy it, and then everybody has one, and it levels off. We see it, and I'm going to show this curve a little bit later, again, with cumulative dam capacity, storage of water behind dams in the United States. We started very low. We learned how to build big dams. We built a lot of them, and then we stopped building them. And I'll come back to that one in a moment. So let me talk about these curves again in the context of water and this idea of peak water. And I'm going to talk about peak renewable water, and I'm going to talk about peak non-renewable water, and then I'm going to talk about peak ecological water in these same three curves. So peak renewable water is this classic logistics curve. So you think about a renewable resource like a river. We humans start to take water out of a renewable resource. Our extraction expands exponentially as we take more and more of it, and then we reach a limit. And that limit is the peak renewable supply of that resource. Think about a river. Once we take all of it, we can't take any more, even if we want to take more. That's the renewable peak limit. And we see this, it begs the question, which I'm going to beg off of, whether we ought to take the complete renewable supply of a river. Obviously, I think we shouldn't. But that's a policy question, it's a political question, and it's a question that we're still wrestling with worldwide. But here's an example. The Colorado River, shared by 7 states in the western US and Mexico. We have a treaty signed in 1944 between the US and Mexico that allocates the water resources of the Colorado River. And this is the flow of the Colorado River from 1905 up until about the present. And it shows a couple of things. First of all, it shows the natural flow before we really started to take water out is variable. Like any river, we have wet years, we have dry years. It shows a decline over the 20th centuries. We started to take more and more water out of the Colorado River for industrial purposes, for agricultural purposes primarily. I should have said at the beginning, this is the flow of the Colorado River measured at the end, at the delta in Mexico. And it shows the fact that we now basically take 100% of the Colorado River, except in really wet years. Basically, the flow of the Colorado River at the delta is 0 because we've reached peak water. In really, really wet years, sometimes there's a little bit of flow reaching the Colorado, but we're doing our best to make sure it stays at 0. And that's peak renewable water. We might want more water out of that system, but we can't have any. But as I suggested, not all water resources are renewable. There are non-renewable stocks of water, and they follow this kind of an example. And the classic is groundwater. Groundwater is a stock. Some groundwater resources are recharged on a fairly short time period, and they might be more renewable than others. But some groundwater resources are fossil aquifers. They're recharged on the order of 100 years or 1,000 years or tens of thousands of years, too slow for human use or interest, not for use, but from a practical point of view, non-renewable. And we see over-extraction of fossil groundwater in the Ogallala Basin, the Central Valley of California, northern India, parts of China, where humans are taking water out faster than it's being recharged. And we see an increase in withdrawals, and then we see a peak in withdrawals, and then we start to see a decline in withdrawals because groundwater levels drop, it becomes more expensive to get, the water disappears entirely from usable resources, it gets contaminated for a variety of reasons, and that's peak non-renewable water. And we see it in places like the Ogallala Aquifer, underlies the Great Plains, responsible for much of our corn and soybean production, a non-renewable aquifer for most of the aquifer. The red parts are, the color indicates the depth to the loss of groundwater and the increasing depth to groundwater. And we've seen farms go out of production in the Great Plains under the Ogallala because farmers can no longer afford to pump groundwater. That's a non-renewable resource. And by some estimates, as much as 30 to 40% of global food production comes from non-renewable groundwater resources. And that is simply unsustainable. And it adds a complication to all of the complication that Ruth talked about earlier. It's part of the water component of that. The last point is peak ecological water. I'm just going to touch on this briefly. The idea of peak ecological water, and this is a graph that shows on the y-axis the overall economic and ecological value of water, and the x-axis the amount of water humans use. And the idea here is that we start to take water out of an ecosystem, and we take more and more water, that's the exponential growth, and the economic benefit to us for a while grows. We put that use to industrial purposes, we grow more food with it, we get more dollars out of it. But we reach a point, a peak ecological point, where the economic benefit of taking another unit of water is exceeded by the loss to ecological value, and the total economic and ecological value starts to decline. And we're good at measuring economic value, we're not great at measuring ecological value, but I would argue that in more and more watersheds around the world, we're past the point of peak ecological water, where the ecological damage we're now seeing from our use of water exceeds the economic benefit that we get from using more of that water. Fisheries extinctions, wetlands collapse, a whole range of ecological damage. And that's the concept of peak ecological water. So what does peak water mean? It doesn't mean we're going to run out of water. Water is largely a renewable resource. It does mean that when we have a non-renewable resource, we're going to run into limits on how much of the non-renewable resource we can use. And we're seeing those limits in more and more regions of the world. It also means that with a renewable resource, we're running into limits, like our river flows. And those limits have to be acknowledged as well. And we're running up against a combination of natural and economic constraints on flow and on ecological barriers as well. So that's the broad concept of peak water. It's a way to think about some of the challenges that we're facing worldwide. Some of them are peak renewable limits, some of them are peak ecological limits, some of them are peak non-renewable, but it's a way of thinking about the nature of the problems we face. There are many other problems. There are problems with energy, there are problems with food production that I've hinted at. There are problems with climate that I've hinted at. There are problems with investment and infrastructure that feed back to some of the political conversations we're having. There are problems with politics and policy. All of these are why water is not a hydrologic problem. It's not a climatological problem. It's a geography problem. It's a cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary problem. I'd also like to argue that the traditional approaches that we used in the 20th century to solve water problems aren't going to be enough in the 21st century, or they're part of the problem themselves. And a couple of quick examples. I showed this one already. The traditional solution to the lack of surface water is pump more groundwater. And that was a great answer in the 20th century. That helped fuel the ability to grow enough food, even if we don't maybe distribute it properly, to feed the world's population today. And in the Ogallala and in the Central Valley of California and in India and China and in more places, peak non-renewable water limits mean that we can no longer rely on groundwater to get us out of our surface water shortages. So that's one piece of this problem. Don't expect groundwater to solve our problems. We already have groundwater problems that we need to solve. The other is this graph that I had a little picture of before. Again, the traditional solution in the developed world, and increasingly in the developing world, was to build big physical infrastructure, build big dams to address flooding problems and deal with droughts and to produce hydroelectric power. And those dams brought enormous benefits to us in the 20th century. Now, we've learned some of the ecological problems that they also brought and some of the community problems that they also brought. But we have to acknowledge that that kind of physical infrastructure was critically important for solving our water problems. And there are places around the world where we need to build more infrastructure in the traditional sense. Although I would argue we better be smarter about how we build it, and we better think about communities, and we better think about ecosystems when we build that traditional infrastructure. But I would also like to argue that building more of that traditional infrastructure is not the solution to our water problems. And this is the curve for the United States, for the cumulative storage of water behind dams. It's the same for California. Frankly, the same curve the curve globally looks the same. And what's going on here is we learned how to build big dams. We built a lot of them, and then it leveled off. The curve leveled off. And it leveled off in the United States because we built on all of the good dam sites, pretty much. And some of you have heard me say this. We built on some not so good dam sites. And it leveled off because in the 20th century, we didn't care about the ecological damage caused by building big dams, or we didn't know about the ecological damage. But we do care today, and we know more today from a scientific and an ecological point of view, and that's a factor in decisions about building big dams. And it leveled off because the federal government had a lot of money that they were willing to throw in a subsidy sense and in a pork barrel economic sense at building big dams, especially in the western United States, but in the Tennessee Valley and in the Pacific Northwest, and that money isn't available anymore either. So for ecological reasons and economic reasons and political reasons and resource limitation reasons, we're not going to build big dams to get out of this problem in the United States. And I would argue, ultimately, worldwide. And we may build a few more big dams in California or the western US or in the United States, but at the end of the day, our water problems are going to look pretty much the same as they do today. So traditional solutions, and I could go on about different kinds of traditional solutions, but you get the idea. So here's the good news. I think there are lots of solutions to our water problems. And I want to present in sort of one slide a contrast between what I call the hard path, that is the traditional solutions that we applied in the 20th century, and what I call the soft path, which is a different way of thinking about water. And let me contrast them. The hard path built for water supply. We built big dams, we dug We dug wells to reach aquifers. We expanded water supply, and that was the focus. Supply is still really, really important, but we have to think differently about supply, and the soft path says, look at traditional supply, but look at new supply as well. And one example of new thinking about supply is wastewater. We spend a lot of money around the world collecting our wastewater with the modern water systems that we've built, treating it often to a pretty high standard, certainly in the United States, and then throwing it away. On the coast, we dump it in the ocean. Admittedly, on the Mississippi River, we put it back in the Mississippi and somebody uses it downstream. So there is natural recycling. But we throw away a tremendous amount of a pretty high quality resource. And it's time to stop calling them wastewater treatment plants. It's time to start calling them water recovery plants, and to treat that water to a high standard and to put it to use. And more, we're doing that. Israel recycles 75% of its highly treated wastewater now. Singapore does it as well. California's moving in that direction. That's one piece of the new way of thinking about supply. But the other side of that equation is demand. So the hard path, the idea was satisfy some projection of demand. Water agencies would think about demand, and demand's going to go up because your population's going to go up and your economy's going to go up. That was the assumption. So let's build new supply to meet that demand. The soft path says, think about what you want. You want to grow food. You want clean clothes. You want to flush your toilets. You want to take a shower. You want to build things that industries that produce things that we want. Those things take water, but all of those things take less water than we're currently spending to do them. So let's think about what we really want, and let's think about the best, most efficient way of spending water to do those things. And that's the idea of demand management and water conservation and efficiency. And every gallon of water that you don't need to use to do the things you want is a gallon of water you don't have to find supply for, and you don't have to take from a natural ecosystem. So demand and rethinking demand is a really critical piece of this puzzle. Hard path says water is an economic good. The soft path says water is an economic good and it's a human right. Now, we didn't think about the human right to water in the 20th century, but in 2010, the UN, after a too long debate about this issue, declared a formal human right to water. And that means a lot of things, and I could talk a lot about it, and there are people here in the audience who know more about that than I do. But water is an economic good and it's a human right, and let's balance those with a soft path. The hard path says let's deal with water in a centralized fashion, build centralized treatment plants, build centralized distribution systems. Let's produce water quality that's potable, and we can use that for everything. We have one set of pipes. And the soft path says, let's think about water quality a little differently. Let's match the qualities of the water we have, which vary, with the qualities of the water we need, which also vary. I mean, right now we're using really incredibly high quality potable water, and we're flushing our toilets with it, and we're watering lawns with it. But we could match the quality of water we have with the quality of water we need, and it would mean a different kind of a water system. And we're beginning to do that on the soft path. The hard path gave no thought to ecosystems and to health. The soft path says you have to think about ecosystems. It's a fundamental part of the sustainable management and use of water. And so protect natural ecosystems, which provide us with clean water and water services that ironically, under the hard path, we then had to spend a lot of money to try and mimic. If we could figure out how to make better use of natural ecosystems and the services those systems provide, it's a different kind of a water system. Finally, the hard path talked about centralized management. Big water agencies, water utilities, state agencies, federal agencies, and so on. And the soft path says let's rethink our institutions around water. Let's get electric utilities and water utilities that never talk to each other to talk together about the water energy nexus. Let's get agricultural systems and water systems to talk about water and food together. There are serious advantages to thinking in an institutional way, the way all of you are beginning to think in an interdisciplinary fashion about water challenges. And that's part of the soft path as well. And all of these things are happening. The good news is that all of these things are happening on the soft path for water. I think we're moving inevitably to a sustainable future for water. And it's going to look like the success stories in new supply and demand management and smart institutions and better economics and all of these things. The trick is to get there faster than we're getting there now. So 2 more slides, just a graph and then a summary. I love this slide. I show it in a lot of my talks. There are 2 curves on this graph. The one is the gross national product of the United States from 1900 to 2010, showing that exponential growth that economists love to see for reasons I won't get into, and which, frankly, I can't really explain. But the exponential growth of the economy is what economists love to see, and that's the US GDP. The other curve is total water withdrawals in the United States for everything: power plant cooling, irrigation, washing your clothes, flushing your toilets, building the widgets that all of us love to buy that take water, from 1900 to 2010. And it shows a couple of things. It shows that exponential curve, that peak assumption that as population grows and our economy grows, I could have showed population as well. Population shows that same exponential curve, moving up together with the economics, up to a point. And that point was in the mid-70s, early 80s, and then those 2 curves split apart. And in the United States today, we use less water for everything, and much less on a per capita basis, than we used in 1980. And we reached, maybe you could call it peak water, or declining water use. And if you think about it for a second, if those 2 curves had continued together, the y-axis on the right shows how much water is required. That's the total water withdrawals. It would have been more water added to that demand for water than we used in 1980. And where would we have found that water? Not in the Colorado River, not in our peak renewable constraints or our peak non-renewable constraints. I don't know. I can't answer that one. I don't know where we would have found that water, but we didn't have to. And we didn't have to because we've become more efficient. Our economy has changed and we're making different things. Some of this is the fact that we shipped our water demand overseas and the industrial goods and services that we now import. There are complicated reasons. But peak constraints drove that. Improved efficiency drove that. Changes in supply drove that. Better economics drove those things. This is good news. If we can get the world on these kinds of curves, we have the ability to restore water for natural ecosystems. We have the ability to move away from peak water, and that's the good news. So in sum, the water problem's real and it's bad. There are costs to doing nothing about it: human costs, economic costs, ecological costs. But not everything is getting worse, and not everything has to get worse. We need new thinking. We need sustainable, scalable, socially responsible solutions that look at new technologies or better use of existing technologies, better use of economics and the human right to water and issues of equity, smarter, more integrated institutions, and ultimately actions. This is the political side of this, and commitments of governments and individuals and communities and new partnerships with the public and the private sector, and better communications. There are all sorts of new remarkable communications tools out there, and those things will move us in the right direction. Thank you very much.
We are going to have a couple of brief discussions of the of what we've heard and some insights from two geographers who are working in this area today. The first is Laura-Anne Minkoff-Zern. She's an assistant professor at Syracuse University. Her undergraduate is in sustainable agriculture, and then she has a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley. She is the chair of the Geography, Food, and Agriculture Specialty Group, and she's also public intellectual. They just have had a op-ed accepted looking at current changes to U.S. agriculture. So please, Laura-Anne.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to make some comments on the really illuminating presentations that we've had. It's an honor to be up here among such distinguished and respected researchers and scholars. I also want to echo how much I appreciate the comments of Doug Richardson, around what the AAG has been doing and making statements and in terms of resisting the politics that are currently going on. So on that note, as we look at the current moment, which I think we can all recognize feels particularly alarming and unique in terms of the intersection of climate change, food and water production and access, and politics, I think it's important to recognize that the historical and political context for how we've gotten here, right? That it feels like a very alarming moment, but there's a lot of history that has gotten us to this point. And I'd say maybe it's not such a different moment than it feels like, maybe fortunately, maybe unfortunately. And I think both Ruth and Peter have pointed out that there's a historical trajectory to where we've gotten in the production of food and kind of the production and consumption of resources. Certainly, science and research did not just become political, and the production of and access to resources such as food and water did not recently become political. And I think only in looking at that historical context and understanding them as political can we come up with the strongest solutions. So I'm going to focus on the politics of food access and distribution. I think as we know, and as was pointed out in the introduction, supply is very important to understand. But I think as Ruth really pointed out, that supply is very nuanced. Food supply and calories don't always equal nutrition. And I also want to point out that that doesn't always equal access, right? So equal access to food is just as important as supply, if not more. So how do we create food systems that foster quality over quantity? So Ruth asked us that question. And I think that question really brings us to the politics of food production, right? So who's in control of the production of food and of our food system, right? And I think it's easy to argue that we're currently in a state where multinational agribusiness companies are in charge of our food system, right? They largely are making the decisions as to what is grown, what is produced, and what kind of access we have. In the current system that we have, profit is certainly the priority over nutrition and over access, right? As is, right, the job of multinational food-producing corporations. Their job is to care about profit, not to care about access and nutrition. Right, but as I would argue, and as many other scholars and activists argue, I think we need to shift to a more locally controlled food system. And that's not to say we need to go backwards. Certainly everyone should not be producing their own food. We don't all want to produce our own food, nor is that kind of a reasonable expectation. Nor do we all need to access locally produced food. That's also not a really reasonable expectation. I live in upstate New York. I'd be eating rutabagas and milk and beef all winter long, right? I'm not willing to do that. So I think we have to understand we're in a globalized food system and we're not gonna take ourselves out of that system, but at the same time understand that local control and a more democratized food system is very important in that context. So I think that means thinking about decision-making and control of the food system on the global scale, but also in the nation-state scale, right? How countries have control over their food system, which largely they don't in terms of the way that it's controlled currently. Regional control, and also community-level control, right? How do we think about food production and consumption and access within our own communities? Peter mentioned the notion of water as a human right. Also, it's a very popular idea to think about food as a human right, and it's currently not treated as one, right? Right now, we've gone in the direction of food being increasingly treated and more like a commodity, and less as a good, right, that should be protected in terms of a human right that we all depend upon to survive. We see that reflected in trade policy, in the way that globalization has occurred in terms of food access and people not having food access. The direction that we've gone in terms of national and international regulations. And I would argue, again, as many others have, that nation states need to have the ability to protect their food supply, right, and protect their food economies from international trade. And to make sure that people are fed with food that is locally produced, if people are producing food locally, and encouraged to be doing so, right, and nutritious, right? And I think that, as Ruth pointed out, if in more traditional food systems, we have more nutritious food, right, as well as food that's suited to people's own economy and culture. I think we also need to look to the fact that the places with the most nutrient-deficient diets, which also comes along, of course, with poverty and hunger-related disease, are also oftentimes the places where people have displaced recently been farmers. Oftentimes countries that still have the highest percentage of land-based people are those that have been or are currently being displaced by cheap food aid and subsidized exports, right? So it's something that's been going on for decades but is currently still in process. So this is not just a question about food access as consumers, right, but also about land access and resource access, right, which is inherently integrated in our political system. Right? You can't take politics out of food access and food supply. If farmers have not been priced out on the market by food dumping, for example, the farmers that I work with are actually immigrants to the U.S. from Mexico that through the process of NAFTA and getting cheap food exports from the U.S. essentially dumped on their economy, have been forced to migrate to the United States and become farm workers, and many of them now are looking to farm again because that's what they know how to do. That's where their knowledge is. And as they move to the U.S., they have less access to nutritious food. They have less access to resources, but many of them would like to be growing their own food again. So if they're not priced out of the market by food dumping, they've struggled to keep up with industrial food production, such as the Green Revolution techniques that may have increased supply, arguably only temporarily in some cases, but have also forced, as farmers have been forced to scale up, both in terms of quantity, they've also had to force up in terms of technologies, which is not reasonable for all farmers. It has essentially forced many farmers out of the market and increased debt for many farmers. Again, leading to higher levels of poverty, which, right, then leads us to higher levels of hunger, ironically, among farmers. I think as what we've seen is that it's more complex than, right, as Glen pointed out, you can't just throw money at it. We also can't just throw technology at the problem. We have to look at access to resources such as land and water. And I think it's also important, as I was saying, right, this longer historical and political context, understanding the power relations that have roots in colonial relationships that have been more recently institutionalized by global trade agreements, right? So all those trade agreements are signed by nation states, right? It's pretty easy to understand they're influenced by corporate lobbying powers and revolving doors. And one last kind of point I want to make is that although I think the regional perspective is really crucial for us to understand what's going on the ground, for the most part, no one with money lacks access to food and water, no matter where they are in the world. Of course, that could change as drought worsens and climate change creates more extremes in weather patterns, but I think we also need to understand that food and water access are directly correlated to flows of capital and related distribution of wealth and power. So just a couple concluding notes. I think we do need to both think historically and think about politics as integrated as part of our food system. But coming back to the current moment, I think that the need for critical work and interdisciplinary work that allows for solidarity among researchers and citizens is more important than ever. I think as geographers, our skill is our ability to study complex geopolitical relationships from physical as well as social perspectives, as I think we've already seen up here tonight, and of course as something we see throughout the conference. But also as geographers, I think we're at the unique nexus of politics and resource use, and therefore we're perfectly situated to understand and influence policy making related to food production, consumption, and distribution. So we need to stay alert to these complex relationships between politics and resource use and put pressure where it's most needed, oftentimes in the places where power is most deeply seated, right, in the wealthiest and most resource-exhaustive communities. Right, so I think we've already seen tonight, right, this isn't as simple as something like aid or exports, but it's about the dynamic politics of power and understanding and kind of becoming more engaged with those complexities. Thank you so much.
So our final discussant then this evening is William Moseley, who's a professor of geography at Macalaster College. He has an undergrad from Carleton in history, master's from Michigan in public policy, and then he went to University of Georgia for his PhD. He has also served with the Peace Corps and has worked in Africa with NGOs and has a lot of on-the-ground experience, just like Laura-Anne has experience in agriculture in California and parts of Latin America. Bill is a public intellectual as well. He's published op-eds in the New York Times as well as the Chronicle of Higher Education. So, Bill, please.
So I, too, I want to thank the AAG and Doug Richardson for their work championing the geographic perspective. I want to thank Glen MacDonald for inviting me to participate in this plenary session. I'm very humbled and honored to be among this august group. And lastly, I want to thank you, the audience, for hanging in there. This is like that killer 3-night evening lecture in grad school. You're hearing lots of interesting facts, but you're dying, right? And now you're in the last 10 minutes, and I promise to be succinct. Geography has a lot to say about the challenges related to food and water, and so I believe it's very appropriate that these themes are highlighted at this year's annual meeting. For your reference, I note that I come at these issues from a political ecology perspective, and that most of my research has been with farming communities in West and Southern Africa. Here I examine critical questions related to farming and to access to food, as well as how these systems interact with power dynamics at various scales, including social difference at the local scale, national policies, regional trade relations, and the policies of international financial institutions. I will use my time to raise a few questions related to the presentations we have just heard this evening and to highlight other issues we might consider when examining food and water. Glen gave a nice introduction to this topic, outlining the challenges of global hunger, water scarcity, and projected areas of population growth. He also highlighted current areas facing famine, so-called crisis spots, and predicted cuts in U.S. foreign assistance. While this presentation of the situation is accurate, there are other ways that we might frame some of these issues. While an increasing human population may mean more mouths to feed, the rate of population growth is decreasing globally, and the globe's population is likely to stabilize around the year 2050. As much or more significant is the fact that the world is becoming more urban, and when people move to urban areas, their diets and consumption habits begin to change. These shifts to higher meat consumption and more processed and packaged foods put as much or more pressure on the global food system as do additional people. Furthermore, we currently live in a world with highly unequal levels of resource consumption, with, for example, one American consuming as much as 70 Ugandans. This means that one American cutting their consumption by 10% will have a bigger impact than, say, preventing 7 new Ugandans from being born. Second, in terms of famine in our world today, it almost never has to do with an absolute lack of food, but with people's inability to access food. Of the 4 areas mentioned by Glen, Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, and northeast Nigeria, the major driver of hunger in these areas is civil strife, not drought or underproduction. This suggests that peacekeeping is a vital tool for preventing famine. And lastly, while the anticipated cuts to the U.S. foreign assistance budget are tragic, and declines in support for food aid are a major blow to global emergency relief efforts, let us not forget that other areas of retrenchment, such as the U.S. pulling back from its climate change commitments, are also quite problematic for global food production. At some point, I suspect Trump will change his view on food aid when he realizes that food aid helps U.S. farmers, one of his key constituencies, and that the social unrest created by famines fuels migration, an issue for his administration, and arguably famine generates some of the conditions amenable to extremism and terrorism. In contrast, I don't see the Trump administration changing their views on climate change. I found Ruth DeFries' presentation to be quite interesting. I especially appreciated her discussion of how the changing mix of grains consumed in India may be contributing to less nutritious diets, which is leading to micronutrient deficiencies. I have seen very similar changes in West Africa, where maize and rice are displacing sorghum and millet, with the result that people have less nutrition and less well-rounded diets. As a geographer, it has been fascinating to explore the various factors driving these changes. And as you might imagine, there is no single factor. This is a complex of issues at play. Rice is a traditional grain in West Africa, and in many cultures was historically reserved for special occasions. We have now seen it morph into a mainstay of many urban diets. The reasons for this are multiple. In some cases, the former colonial power, especially France, had a preference or a bias for rice, encouraging its production in material ways through projects and extension efforts. But they also encouraged it discursively, framing rice as a modern food that civilized people eat, as opposed to sorghum and millet being the food of the peasants. As such, we have seen rice grow to be a mainstay of middle-class urban diets, with many middle-class households feeling like it is imperative to offer rice at the midday or noon meal. Rice is also a labor-saving technology for cooks, who are mostly female in the West African context. When I interviewed urban households in Bamako, the capital of Mali, in 2009, shortly after the 2007-2008 global food crisis, women consistently noted how rice was quicker to prepare than sorghum and millet, and that this was important in their increasingly busy lives. They further mentioned the now cultural expectation that middle-class households serve rice at the noon meal, and lastly, they described how they liked how rice expanded in the pot, creating more volume to fill people's bellies. But there are also important political economic factors driving dietary changes in West Africa. The region is now highly dependent on rice imported from Asia, especially Vietnam and Thailand, a situation which has created an enormous amount of social unrest in cities, particularly in the 2007-2008 period, when global rice prices rose 100%. Some of this is related to the fact that Thailand and Vietnam have become major global rice exporters, following their respective green revolutions, creating a situation where there was lots of relatively inexpensive rice on global markets. Furthermore, it's not the top quality rice that is being exported to West African markets. It is substandard broken rice that is less desirable in Asia. In fact, a recent study revealed that a lot of the rice reaching West Africa from Asia was formerly held in national security stocks, which are periodically emptied and replenished. This rice is often 10 to 20 years old and of extremely poor nutritional quality. In addition to cheap rice supplies from Asia, we had neoliberalism, structural adjustment in the 1980s and 1990s, which tore down tariff barriers in West Africa and dramatically reduced state support for domestic rice production. This combination of factors helps us understand why West Africa's urban populations have become so dependent on imported rice from Asia. I also greatly enjoyed Peter Gleick's presentation. I found the notion of peak water to be useful. I can't help but think of peak oil when we discuss peak water. In the case of peak oil, we keep developing new technologies, such as fracking, to increase the size of economically exploitable reserves. We seem further down the path with water than with oil, in the sense that we have been trying to mine water for a lot longer than we have been trying to extract oil. The consequences of running out of water are also more dire than running out of fossil fuels. But as Peter points out, while some water is a stock resource, much of it is a flow resource. Water in these cases is renewable. So the trick is to live within the limits of a certain rate of flow, a rate of flow that may be declining in some cases because of climate change. Agriculture, of course, is a huge piece of the puzzle in terms of managing our use of water, as it accounts for the majority of water use in most cases. Heretofore, in our attempts to increase food production, we have often developed agricultural systems that use very high volumes of water as well as fossil fuel energy, with fossil fuel use ironically contributing to climate change that more constrains our water supplies. I wanted to end by bringing up a couple of points which I believe deserve more attention. The first is the issue of food access, and here I'm going to echo some of Laura's comments. As I mentioned at the start, famine is rarely about an absolute lack of food, but people's inability to access food. We know this from the work of Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, who framed this in terms of entitlements, or people's legal access to food. People may grow their own food, purchase it with income they earn, or receive food gifts from extended family and neighbors. Famine is about entitlement failure. In the early 1980s, geographers like William Dondo and Michael Watts were also writing about the problem of food access. The way we are trying to address the global food problem today does not give adequate attention to access. We continue to frame this as a production problem. That is, we need to produce more food via industrial and green revolution techniques. I don't question that these approaches can help us increase food production. The problem is that they exacerbate our water problem and don't address access issues for the poorest of the poor, those households which are food insecure and hungry. They can't afford the high cost of these technologies and the risk associated with taking out credit to buy them. I believe agroecology represents an alternative path for the poorest of the poor. How do we intelligently use our knowledge of agroecosystems, of plant-plant interactions and plant-insect interactions to produce more food and reduce crop losses? For example, intercropping, the intelligent mixing of different crops, such as legumes and grains, leads to significant production gains and reduces damage from pests. Furthermore, through integrated crop livestock systems, we can better harness animal waste to increase organic matter content in our agricultural soils. The important aspect of these systems for the poorest of the poor is they don't involve buying a lot of purchased inputs and taking on increased financial risk. These systems increase access to food for the poorest of the poor, and they're less water intensive. The other way we've been trying to address the global food problem is through increasing commercialization of our agricultural systems. Subsistence farmers are often framed as the problem. They need to adopt modern techniques to produce more food, and they need to sell some of their crops to pay for these inputs and technologies. The commercialization of agriculture has already happened in some areas of West Africa. What has the result been for food security and nutrition? In southern Mali, where I work, in the province or region of Sakasso, They have fully embraced commercial cotton production since the time of the French colonial era. This is by far and away the richest region in the country. Yet paradoxically, this region also suffers from the highest levels of child malnutrition, even higher than drought-prone areas in the north, areas that are also racked by civil strife. How do we explain this paradox of relative wealth and malnutrition? Well, part of it relates to some of the issues Ruth mentioned, a changing regime of food crops. In southern Mali, along with cotton production, we have seen the rise of maize production, a crop which has been bred to be more responsive to the use of inorganic fertilizers, and maize is less nutritious than sorghum and millet, the traditional food crops. But increased commercialization has also meant that people buy more of their food now, and furthermore, men tend to have a bigger say in how that income is used. While we don't know for sure, increased commercialization may mean a loss of power for women in households, and this could have a big impact on nutrition. So I'm going to end by noting that I believe, again, geographers have a huge contribution to make to our vexing problem of food and water challenges. We need to continue to problematize the conventional productionist thinking and to generate alternative creative solutions. Thank you.
Folks, it's late. You know, these guys are hungry, and I thank you for sticking it out. I think that was a great ending. I think all the talks were great. Please join me in giving a big round of applause to our speakers, and good evening to you.